Good afternoon, my name is Hannah. We're all here today to ask some questions of some academics about the Duty of Care Bill and what this could mean for young people's futures and what this could mean for Australia's climate action trajectory. Here with me, first up in the hot seat, is Professor Mark Howden. Professor Howden is the director of the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. He's also the vice chair of the IPBC, as well as a whole other list of very impressive credentials that I won't rattle off. But I would like to pass the mic over to Mackenna, who's here to ask the first question of Mark.
Thanks, Mark, for your time today. We're curious to hear from you from a climate perspective and also your experience, why we actually really need this bill.
Thanks, Mackenna. It's very clear that climate change is happening really quickly now, worse than we predicted a few years ago, and the projections at the moment are not good. They are for a more problematic Australia, and those problems will accrue over the years, over the decades, and that will impact on your quality of life, on your opportunities as a young person as you grow into adulthood. And so it's crucial, in my view, that young people have a say in these issues, because you're going to be living through the worst of the climate change crisis that we're approaching.
Thank you.
Pass back over to Mia.
I was just wondering what would be the potential impact of this bill on Australia's emissions reductions pathways?
Thanks, Mayor. It's not clear that there's a direct link there, except I think there's an indirect link by raising the bar of social concerns about climate change and translating that into political action. So the things that really matter in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas footprint, particularly around large-scale industry. So we need to tighten up on the emissions from those industry sectors, but looking at emissions right across our value chains and how we can reduce those, everything from transport, which we're already starting to bite into with electric vehicles, and through to electricity generation, industrial activity, and our food systems, amongst others. And we all can play a part in doing this. So it's not just the big emitters like the coal-fired power stations and similar things, but as well as having individual action, we need to be pushing up to government and industry to demand better action from them. So putting in place the products and policies that allow us to have lower emissions lifestyles, so we all can play a part in reducing climate change.
Yeah, thank you.
Lovely. So final question for you today, Mark. How do you think this bill could help us with fostering better cohesion and relations with our Indigenous community?
Well, that's one I haven't really thought about, Aleesya. I hadn't linked those together. But very clearly, we need to have a more just Australia. We see that in many different ways, not just in terms of climate change. Right now, one of the big issues, of course, is gender-based violence. And we need to be addressing equity and justice issues right across our society, not just in terms of climate change. So I see this as part of a much broader movement to ending up a much more just, equitable and desirable Australia to live in.
I think I have one more question coming off that as well. What you mentioned before around reducing Australia's emissions, we often hear that Australia's emissions are only a drop in the bucket compared to the likes of, let's say, China and US and other large economies around the world. But we also know that Australia is one of the world's biggest exporter of fossil fuel emissions. I think just behind Qatar and Russia, we're massive in terms of, especially with gas as well. And so we know that this bill not only looks at Australia's domestic emissions, but also the life cycle emissions of the fossil fuel projects. Do you think the approach taken by this bill, I guess, how do you think that's going to reduce the impacts of climate change? Do you think it's a sound approach for a bill such as this to take?
Well, going back to your first point, which is, the argument that Australia is a small component to global emissions, it's a logical fallacy, because every person, every country can argue the same thing. So, even the biggest emitter can say, "Oh, I'm only a quarter of the global emissions, and so I don't matter too much." And then you can say take a jurisdictional approach. So, one city in China could say, "Well, yes, our country is a big emitter, but we as a city are a small component of that, so we don't really matter." And so everyone can make that argument that we don't really matter, but yet it's a global issue, so we all do matter. We all contribute to the outcomes, the global outcomes. Some obviously contribute more than others. So the question about the bill, it depends on how it's actually implemented, and so it seems to me putting in place legal components to restrict future greenhouse gas emissions is one part of a bigger picture. So we need to have multiple elements in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I come back to the argument that a lot of economists run, which is the simple and most effective way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions is to put a price on them. And in Australia, politically, that's sort of an unviable proposition at the moment. And so the best option, the first cab off the rank option is one that we can't put in place. So we're going to second, third and fourth ranked options rather than actually going for the best.
That's really interesting. Any other questions, any other thoughts? Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Mark, for your time today. We really appreciate your expertise and your time in being here.
Thanks, Anna.
Fabulous.
Thanks, everyone.
Fabulous. Next up, we have Professor Sharon Friel. So Sharon is an ARC Laureate Fellow, Professor of Health Equity, and Director of the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse and the Menzies Centre for Health Governance at the School of Regulation and Global Governments, or REDNET for short. She works in around the political economy of health government and planetary, social and commercial determinants of health impacts. Thank you so much, Sharon, for being here. First question is from Mia.
From a health perspective, why do you think we need this bill, and what could this bill do to help mitigate the health impacts of climate change?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important opportunity to look out for people's health now and into the future. So climate change affects our health in lots of different ways. It affects our physical and our mental health in a number of ways. If we don't do something about climate change now, the young people of today will have increased risk of respiratory disease. They'll have increased risk of cardiovascular disease. They'll have increased risk of mental ill health as a consequence of climate change. And they'll have all of that right now, but it'll also track through into adulthood. The child that is not born yet, we now know that air pollution really is affecting the unborn child in ways that we didn't know previously, but that has long-term implications for cognitive development and mental well-being. So the bill offers such an important opportunity to prevent those ill health. And it's also that intergenerational inequity so already the physical and mental health conditions are already unequally distributed within countries, between countries. And then climate change comes and exacerbates those physical and mental conditions between population groups, between countries. But the intergenerational aspect of it is going to be so significant. The tail, particularly with mental health, the tail of mental health into the future is just going to go through the roof.
Yeah, thank you. I was really interested to hear about mental health in relation to that as well. So thank you for addressing that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I guess coming specifically for this bill as well, what we've heard from politicians and other decision makers is that none of the health impacts of climate change are under inquiry. We know that they're coming. We know that our generation will bear the brunt of those impacts as well. But what we've heard is that this bill is too hard. This bill doesn't take the right approach to looking at the health impacts of a project 50 years down the line, and how do you measure the emissions of one project? How do you actually quantify that in terms of a health impact for future generations? And so my question to you is, in your opinion, are the health impacts of climate change something that decision makers in government can assess for individual projects? Is there enough of an evidence base for them to look at and say, this project will release this amount of emissions, and therefore translating that into worse health outcomes and worse equity outcomes in the health sphere as well.
So, two parts to the answer to that. We know already historically, there has been quantifiable demonstration of what climate change is doing to loss of life, for loss of life. So we already know that, whether that's through issues of food security, whether it's through issues of extreme weather events and sort of that immediate threat to life. So there's a number of different ways. So that's been quantified. And so, is it about a particular amount of carbon or a particular amount of emissions? I think it's just such a stupid point, because climate change is one of those cross-boundary issues. It comes from across different sectors. Emissions are happening all over the place. So is it that there's ever going to be one thing that's going to intervene, and it's attributable to that? So in the health world, in the public health world, that's such a difficult thing to do. Such difficult. It's an attribution. It's referred to as the attribution effect. And we know that so many of the factors, or the factors that contribute to health, to physical and mental health, are multifactorial. So how do you tease it apart? Well, actually, I would say there are common drivers of these multiple factors. Isn't it incredible to think that there could be an intervention that's addressing some of these common drivers, and you've got this incredible flow through for both emissions, for climate, and for health outcomes? So that's a very long-winded way of saying it's very difficult to attribute from one project, and all of the evidence tells us that there are multiple factors that contribute to these big wicked problems, and health is one of those things. But we know that making a change, you're preventing further climate change, will have immediate and long-term impacts on people's physical and mental health.
Yes.
So I just don't think it's a fair thing for government to say, oh, well, it's not for anybody to say, oh, this is going to be a really difficult thing to do. It's just stop climate change and it will have incredible health benefits.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And interesting hearing from experts across the board who are saying we need to do as much as we can. It doesn't matter about, well, it does obviously matter, but it doesn't matter about the individual projects. It's just about what can we do across the board to try and reduce emissions and therefore reduce the impacts of climate change on health as well. So thank you for that. Over to Mackenna.
Thank you so much for your answers so far as well. Briefly, before you mentioned this principle of intergenerational equity, particularly regarding health outcomes, I know you've done a lot of research in that area. Would you take a moment to speak a little bit more towards why that principle is so important and how it specifically applies to climate change? And then sort of, this is the third part, how this bill specifically would uphold that principle and lead to better outcomes.
Yeah, so let's start from the question of equity or inequities or justice and fairness, and then in the context of the state of government, and government is there to protect, support, and enable its citizens. So immediately you have a principle already built in there of justice and fairness to look after all its citizens. And in my work, we ask the questions around inequities, equity or inequities in particular, and health inequities. And the inequity aspect of it, or the equity aspect of it, is it's very sort of normative, and it's very about saying there is no biological explanation for the differences of the experience of society and then the health consequences, or climate in this instance. There's no biological explanation for those differences. It's the fact that there's something unfair and unjust happening within society that's creating these differences. And so from that principle, you can do something about it. It can be changed because it's a principle of fairness and justice. And so the intergenerational question, and with this, with the issue we're speaking about today, is recognizing that decisions that are taken today have this long-term and generational implication. And that, in and of itself, is a question of justice. What are those implications? What's the likely fair or unfair outcomes that we can expect to see? And we know that with the baked-in climate change already, and if we don't do something to mitigate that much more, then the experience and the evidence that we have today showing what climate change is doing to people's physical and mental health and the inequities within that, the health effects of climate change, it's exacerbating the existing social and health inequities. So we know that already. And so the intergenerational inequity is just going to get worse. So you've got the temporal effect, as well as the ongoing exacerbation of the social inequity related to health.
Yeah, absolutely. I can hear that principle of people's lives mattering and the impacts on their health does really span regardless of when those people are, whether they're young people or old people. Yeah. And that's what gives rise to the obligation within this bill specifically. Yeah. Thank you
very much.
So a further question on generational health equity. What drives the differences in outcomes, and what's the impact on society having these higher levels of health inequity?
Yeah, well, so let me start with sort of inequity more generally, and then I'll connect it to the health inequities. So more unequal societies have a whole load of poor outcomes as a consequence of inequality itself. We've seen that. So the more unequal a society, the more unequal the educational attainments, the more unequal the physical and the mental health, the more unequal the sense of satisfaction we have in life, and the worse the trust is within a society, which is important for democracy and so. So there's that. It's about the sense of cohesion and the sense of connectedness that really matters for a sense of well-being within society. So inequality is bad. Full stop. Then the health inequities create all sorts of challenges for both the health system and the costs to society. So if it costs more to have more health inequities within society, and so then even things like being able to have climate adaptation program, revenue for climate adaptation programs, or revenue for social programs, or other health services, that gets depleted because of these health inequities. So it really starts to eat up the budget. I forgot the rest of the question.
What were the impacts? Sorry. Yeah, well, I guess what could this bill do to try and minimize those inequities in health as well?
Well, first of all, what it does is it says this is not a good thing. And that's a very important thing. We don't really have a lot in the Australian context that says inequities are not good. So if nothing else, that's fantastic. And then what the bill then starts to do is operationalise resources to address those social inequities that are exacerbated by both climate change and then what that means for well-being and health. So it sets a whole load of supports in motion based on a principle.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for your time, Sharon. It's been fabulous hearing from you today. Next up, we have Professor Joe Ford. Professor Ford is an associate professor at the ANU College of Law, focusing on the nexus of law, governance, and development. He's interested in the way that we can influence responsible business and investor activity in fragile, conflict-affected, and transitional societies, and emerging frameworks on business and human rights. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you.
So first up, we have Aleesya.
Thank you so much, Joe, for letting us have your time today. From a legal perspective, why do you believe that this bill is something that we need to have?
Yeah, well, as Sharon just mentioned, sometimes just the message that comes from the campaign towards the bill, even if the bill never sees the light of day, can be valuable overall. I think I might answer your question by anticipating some of the resistance to the idea, right? And some of that resistance will come from lawyers. Some of it's already come from courts. And some of it is probably understandable when we frame things in terms of this language of duty of care, because it conjures up for people the idea of suing for financial compensation and finding specific wrongdoers, and for a problem which is society-wide, that can lead to sort of some apprehension. And then there's all sorts of sort of legal definitional things that lawyers get awkward about, and sort of what is spiritual well-being, and how do we quantify impact on it, or what is a significant decision and what is not a significant decision. But I think some of that resistance we have to acknowledge, because there are some decisions in society which are, there are limits to the extent to which we can juridify them, by which I mean sort of force them down narrow legal channels and transfer from some parts of government, the executive and the legislature, to the judiciary, in cases where we've already seen in the Sharma litigation, the courts are very, and have long been uncomfortable with being placed in a position where they see themselves as in an inappropriate, a role that is inappropriate for them as courts, and that they're not well equipped to do, which is to second guess essentially policy decisions by government. Should we do more of X or more of Y? Should we spend resources here or there? And courts have always declined to get involved in what they see as policy decisions, as opposed to lower level sort of operational decisions. So some of that resistance is there, and I think we need to acknowledge it and engage with it, because this will only be a part of the puzzle. I mean, there's still the much broader relationship between the governed and the governors, which in a representative and responsible system of government like ours, ultimately it's not about litigation, it's about election. If the government is not doing all these things, taking care, then the government can be changed. So I say that as a lawyer because there are limits to what law and legal frames can do. But I think if a bunch of lawyers were here and they heard about the idea of this very broad duty of care and felt that kind of resistance for all those reasons, if you explained it to them as something really not unfamiliar, which is just making very explicit a mandatory consideration that a decision maker needs to at least consider in the process of their decision making, they'd say, okay, fine, that happens all the time, and those decisions can be judicially reviewed. So when it's framed in that way, I think, from our previous conversation, it's just making explicit and introducing into the conversation, which is partly a policy, or mostly a policy conversation and a political conversation, a series of explicit considerations that a decision maker must at least put their mind to. They might still decide on a different outcome, but at least they have to show that they put their mind to those considerations.
Cool. Thank you so much, Joe. I think the idea of recontextualizing, I guess, the aims of the bill to sort of fit into the perspective of people who have that resistance is really important, and will help us sort of better engage with people who are anti this bill and hopefully change some minds in the future.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Joe. Over to Mackenna.
Specifically on what you were talking about in terms of it is from a policy level about this mandated consideration, I'm curious how you think in practice this bill would manifest itself in the decision makers. So, for example, what you think in day-to-day this actual consideration looks like from a decision maker when they're looking at a fossil fuel project. And potentially, if you want to consider whether this is too burdensome an obligation, which is one of the critiques that's been raised.
Yeah, well, I mean, we already have some insight into that because we've got at least a couple of, in recent times, federal court decisions about claims that a minister, for example, late last year, that a minister should have applied certain evidence to her decision on to whether to approve certain fossil fuel projects. So I think we can start to imagine what that might actually look like in practice. And again, it goes to, in this town, Canberra, anticipating and engaging with resistance among lawmakers themselves, who are the ones who ultimately have to vote on this, in terms of the sorts of obligations it would give them were they to find themselves as the responsible minister making those sorts of decisions. But in all areas of administration of society, decision makers are given, mandatory or discretionary criteria. And I think the messaging around the bill is important in terms of it's not trying to constrain and take out of the elected, we live in a democracy, the elected representative government's ability to, on the day, to take various policy decisions. It's just putting in place an obligation of process rather than an obligation of outcome that sends a message that you need to at least be able to demonstrate, if challenged, whether or not you took into account the evidence suggesting that this impact might be a likely outcome of this project being approved. And I think you can find analogies to all sorts of areas where administrative decision makers are required to do that all the time. It's nothing revolutionary. I think, going back to the previous answer, because it's framed in duty of care, by which we think of all those high-profile media things where public authorities are sued because someone injured themselves, in some risky recreational activity, and people say, well, the taxpayer shouldn't have to compensate for that. So it carries all that baggage, whereas if we are just talking about explicit mandatory considerations during administrative decisions, I think those things happen all the time in this town and wouldn't be so alarming.
Yeah, that's excellent to hear. It's really not a burdensome addition, but something that's quite within that process already, and that consideration to be taken on is achievable. It's excellent.
Yeah, and I think we've also, just very quickly, we've got to be careful. There's a dark side to all this sort of stuff, which is that we can create a requirement that a decision maker must consider this, and then we sort of relax. And that's what I mentioned earlier about the risk of kind of forcing things into narrow legal frameworks, is that it can be a lazy form of politics. Say, well, now the Act exists and the issue is done. Whereas, it's quite possible for a decision maker to say, yes, I have considered this and I've rejected it. And the exercise of their discretion, that could be a reasonable thing for them to do. So we've got to be always conscious that it's not, it's still a bill, it's not an act. But even if it became an act, it's not the end. It's only one piece of a puzzle towards trying to, in the absence of what Mark was referring to, being able to create an economic incentive, a price incentive to change behavior, other ways to try and shape behavior in the meantime. But at the end of the day, I tend to agree with what was implicit in Mark's comment, which is that at the end of the day, it's those massive economic incentives which are going to drive behavior. This legislation is just a part of that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just curious about something that you began touching on earlier. So the first time this concept of a duty of care kind of became before the Australian courts was in Sharma v. Minister for the Environment. And upon appeal, the court's judgment was that this was a policy decision, not a judicial decision to be made. And I'm curious what litigation you think we could expect in response if this bill did become law, and how the courts would apply and interpret this duty of care if it were a policy.
Yeah, so in both the Sharma case and then the more recent federal court case of Justice McElwain, in both cases, the Chief Justice, also Justice McElwain, said something to the effect of, in effect saying to the litigants, if you want to go to Parliament and ask them to create a statutory duty, then that's open to you to do. But the courts, can't bring one into existence in those sorts of situations. So those challenges are not going to go away when framed in terms of the law of torts just because they're inherent to the limits of this concept of a duty of care. It's always going to be limited in terms of how courts stay away from policy decisions for which they're not equipped. They stay away from imposing a duty of care where there's the specter of indeterminate liability for an indeterminate amount over an indeterminate period of time to an indeterminately large class of plaintiffs. No court is going to do that. And in a constitutional democracy, we should be nervous if a court thought it could do that, right, on one level. So Australia's going to have a different journey to some other countries. Our brothers and sisters in Aotearoa and New Zealand have a Human Rights Act, which creates different legal opportunities. Some of them are before the New Zealand Court of Appeal at the moment. And we saw human rights-based argument being used to effect in Strasbourg in the European Court of Human Rights just recently. Some of those decisions I personally think could lead to a bit of backlash. So I don't think harnessing the human rights frame in pursuit of climate justice has lots of potential, but again, it has its limits as well, because sometimes the reasoning has to be so stretched on the part of the judges that it's inevitably going to lead to some backlash against their mandate. So yeah, the duty of care concept has its place. And of course, one of the questions to one of the earlier speakers was about forward-looking intergenerational equity. But I think we live in an age where we're also trying to address the damage that's already been done and justice for existing wrongs and harms and stuff. And that's a whole different set of legal questions where maybe torts is useful, but it always has its limits. One of the limits that's always going to come up is around causation and attribution that Sharon also talked about, the attribution effects. And especially where you have multiple wrongdoers. It can't be said that one particular defendant can be isolated, one particular fossil fuel company can be isolated. It's quite a strong and legitimate answer for them to say, why me?
Thank you for your response. Hannah?
Yeah, but one more quick question. And touching on that human rights frame you brought up before, we know that 161 countries around the world have recognised in the UN resolution that the right to a healthy environment exists for children and future generations. I guess, is this bill an appropriate mechanism to try and enshrine that? So Australia wasn't one of them. Australia wasn't one of the countries that voted to support that resolution. What can this bill, in taking the approach that it does, is there a valid human rights element there? Be interested in your thoughts about some of those human rights implications of the bill as well.
Yeah, well, I might not have a popular answer to that because I'm a bit skeptical about framing it too much in terms of human rights, particularly in the Australian context. I don't think it's a very fruitful avenue to go down, and it can lead to pushback in all sorts of ways. But I think what it does open up is just another front of contestation, and ultimately this is a contest over ideas and values and so on. So framing things experimentally in terms of rights can get progress in some areas, but in other areas it might actually not have the same effect. I don't think in this town, Canberra, necessarily framing something to a policy audience, political audience, in rights terms necessarily suddenly gives it urgency. So I tease my human rights colleagues and human rights advocate colleagues by saying that it's not as if you walked up to Parliament Hill and said, by the way, action on climate change is a human rights issue. Everyone on Parliament Hill would say, oh, why didn't someone tell us? In that case, let's drop everything and do it. So I don't think it's a panacea, and certainly not in the Australian context, just because constitutionally we don't have those a human rights framework which is readily able to be litigated in the way that you have in Europe and elsewhere.
Yeah, fabulous. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Joe. It's really valuable to hear from you and some of your legal insights into the bill. That's all we have time for today, but thank you so much to our academics as well, to Mark and Sharon. Thank you very much. And to ANU Institute of Climate Energy and Disaster Solutions, thank you for having us. Thank you for your support, as always. And yeah, thanks again.